Welcome to the Idaho Main Street Podcast, where we talk about the issues that matter to you. All right, welcome to the Idaho Main Street Podcast. We're here with a frequent guest, but not frequent enough. Anytime Senator Dave Lent joins us, it's always thought-provoking, and I always leave feeling inspired and ready to go, and I also leave feeling a little insecure because I'm not nearly as smart as Dave, but one day I'll get there. So, Chair of Senate Education in the midst of this session. Dave, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks, and you're being very kind. And here it is, the end of it. We're here on a Friday afternoon, and my brain's about mush. And I'm thinking, who's he talking about there?
It's you.
Oh,
It's you, Dave.
well, I appreciate
Would
that.
Terry not describe you the same way?
Well, maybe some days, but not all.
Are you driving back after this, or are we staying?
No, she's actually coming over this weekend. We have an activity we're doing this weekend. The daughter's coming to town, and so we're excited about that.
Good. Something to look forward to after a long week.
Yeah, there's a really exciting event this weekend. It's this interfaith event that's happening at the Idaho Center. And my daughter is performing it as one of the performers there. She has a singing group and has for many years, and her and two other ladies. So they'll be the main performers this weekend at the Idaho Center.
Interesting. Did she get her singing voice from you?
No.
Oh.
My singing voice, of course, I'm banned from my home. And the only thing I play instrument-wise is the radio, so that's about it.
Which is funny because my dad always says I have the face for radio, so it's perfect. Dave, there's a few things we're going to have to get into today. We always reference, there's always kind of, you do a great job of when we talk about issues, you also kind of take it back a few steps and say, well, before this, we were talking about leadership styles and why that's important and different ways to get control and what's short-term, long-term. And it comes from your career of, knowing the right parts of organizational leadership and the ways to look at problems differently. We got what you'd consider like an education challenge. Maybe we won't call it a problem in Idaho. And you've taken a few steps back and you're saying, okay, we're going to look at this differently. I want to have a kind of a macro conversation about that and then boil down into some legislation you've proposed in hopes to fix it. So what's going on with education in Idaho?
Well, it's not only Idaho, but it's really something that's happened, and it goes back to, I like to use the example of I was working at a nuclear plant as a consultant in the 80s, and first time I had an IBM computer on my desk. In the 90s, the internet came out. In the 2000s, it was smartphones. And I read a book recently called The Anxious Generation that really talked about the effects on our culture of technology and more specifically social media. And then it went into detail about how different age groups are really affected specifically by that. Specifically like your middle schoolers and how impressionable they are and some of the things that have come out of that, So as I have kind of been in this education thing a while and spent a lot of time thinking about it, school choice, it has occurred to me that school choice is really a symptom of a bigger problem. People are leaving public education because of specific reasons. And if we want to really solve the challenges we have with public education, you have to understand the problem. And for me, the problem was our culture and society has evolved faster than the institution of public education. And so what happens is you get to the point where people look back at our traditional public education and say it's broken, it doesn't work, when in reality what's changed is our culture and our people. And for example, the kids coming into school nowadays, they're not the same as they were 20 or 30 years ago. I read the other day that 25% of our workforce now are digital natives. And if you think about that, that means that not only are the kids coming in, but their parents are also coming from a different perspective. So if you consider the fact that we had all this evolution, if you will, in our society because of technology in a very short period of time, relatively short, 30 years, 20, 30 years. And then on top of that, you add COVID. You have this accelerated, intensified feeling of what's wrong, it's broke kind of thing. So what I think I've really come to the conclusion is that the way we're going to address this is we need to stop. We need to accept the fact that the educational needs of today are different than they were just 20 years ago. That box that was built 100 years ago, 150 years ago that we call public education, that was built on an industrial model. It was like, what's your date of birth? When you go to school, you sit in a class for X amount of hours. You earn X amount of credits. That very industrial model is really, we're struggling with it today. because we've kind of moved on with technology and just-in-time learning and the internet. So that brings us to the point of, and we're proposing that, and we'll get to this, but this is really a broad look. I'm spending a lot of time in the Capitol working with legislators and educators, rethinking how could it change. And I was reading in the Constitution, and the Constitution says, it is the duty of the legislature to establish and maintain a system of free common schools, and it goes on there. So from that, it's like, well, maybe the legislature should lead out. Maybe the legislature, because by constitutional responsibility, it says it's your duty to do this. So where that brings us to essentially is I'm working with legislators now to kind of roll out a way for them to go into their communities and have grassroots discussion about, and it's a very simple discussion that goes something like this. If we could clear the table, don't worry so much about money right now, don't worry so much about regulation, but if we could invent public education, reinvent it today, what would it look like? And so it's great as I talk to legislators, I say, yes, I need that to go to my town halls. Let's get this going. The plan would be essentially we would gather that information this spring and this summer. A few of us would get together this fall. We would tabulate that information. The state board has agreed to help us put that together in a website where people could bring that information back. And then next spring when we're in session, we bring forth legislation, and this is the part I like. We bring forth legislation that says, you know, when we created charter schools, the premise was they would be the source of innovative change. And what we've seen is we have thriving charter schools almost in a competitive nature now with our public schools. So if you stop and say, is there something we could do that would accelerate that innovative change that we wanted, but we need it terribly even more now? So here's the thought. What if we wrote legislation, and this week I was able to go into the governor's office and talk. What if we had legislation that said we would like to invite 5 districts in our state to self-select, and here's what we've learned from the grassroots discussions we've had this last few months with the state of Idaho, with Rotary clubs, with Chamber of Commerce, with local PTAs, with school boards. You float this information up, and then you say, okay, 5 districts, we are going to give you free rein, pretty much. I mean, there will be boundaries. We would like to reinvent yourself in your community. We will fund you, and we're going to give you 3 years. And we want you to innovate that change and accelerate that. And at the end of 3 years, then we would come back and say, what have we learned? How can we change public education in general? But I'm convinced that that's what we have to do until we do something on that kind of scale. And it's not to say that all of our educators or our schools are bad or that they're not doing a great job. It's just that we have to accelerate that evolution to be a better fit. And the evidence of that is we see people leaving public education. And a great example is discipline in classrooms. You know, a student comes home and said, can you believe what happened in my classroom today? We had to exit 2 times because of a student was acting up, and we had to do that. So it's pretty common as I talk to people in education that they know we need to do something. And I'm convinced that the legislature is in the right place. This is the right time to go forward and make these kind of changes to really help our state really move to the forefront in innovative public education.
Man, it's got to scare people, though, hearing the idea of like blowing up the current system. My first thought is, protect what you already have, which is not very innovative, which is not very forward thinking, and it's going to leave us behind. Are you finding a lot of that type of opposition?
Well, sure, because we have created a system that's heavily weighted on management. How do you manage the education system? And you do that by you define success by things that are easy to measure. Standardized tests, teacher evaluations. We do that, and that's managing versus if you switch over and say, what is the educational leadership? Of course, you have to manage, but have we sacrificed educational leadership, which includes the innovative things? And the second piece to that, as a legislature, we have to create a system that doesn't tie our administrators and teachers' hands. We have great teachers that are frustrated because they feel like they're at the end of the rope and they just have to do whatever they're doing. So to bring back that love and passion in education, we have to kind of reinvent our approach to how we do it. I think it'll be an overall success. And granted, it's a little risky, but any change typically brings a level of risk. From a leadership point of view, what you want to do is identify those risks, mitigate them, and then move forward in a cautious manner so that you can move from point A to point B. The safe place is to sit back and say, it's okay. The reality is okay isn't going to cut it for our kids. And if that's what it's about, we've got to do something.
Yeah, and I love your willingness to think long term rather than protection to the next election, right? And that's what we need is real leadership, is thinking long term and willing to cut deals and make compromises when necessary. And we've talked about that before. You've been on the podcast in the past, and you haven't been shy about your love of public education, your concern about taking dollars away from public schools and siphoning them to private or home schools without accountability, without anyone watching. And that's the big hot debate right now is, well, what do we do with voucher systems? And Idaho has great school choice, but when it comes to vouchers or ESAs and blowing up budgets, how do we do that? And it would be a conversation that if I was chair of Senate Ed, I would want to hide under my desk at times, and you've done the exact opposite. You've put your name on a bill and you're kind of putting your neck out there. Talk us through kind of where you're at right now with this issue and what's changed.
So, Brendan, you're right. I have been, I would say I'm a proponent of school choice. If you go to Idaho Falls, you'll see Compass Academy, which was created because we felt parents and teachers needed more options. And as a school board, we put our heads together. We converted a junior high into a project-based high school. That's all about options, and it was very innovative, and I think it's worked out well. So the challenge, though, is when you take sacred tax dollars and you hand them to someone and say, go do whatever you're going to do, that's contrary to real conservative government, I think. It's contrary to the principles that I believe in, and you get into all these things about taxation without representation. If my tax dollars are going somewhere and I'm handing them across the street saying, here's school, go do whatever you're going to do. You don't have to report. You don't have to do anything. In fact, you can make your own rules. To me, that's taxation without representation. And I mean, we can go down a lot of streets there, but where we're at today is when the governor did his state of the state and he kind of said, hey, I've got $50 million here and I'd like to see it expand school choice. It kind of, in a way, it put us in a corner. In other words, it meant that we were going to see school choice legislation and it would make it to his desk. And there, if it had the right kind of ingredients, so to speak, he was going to sign it. So I couldn't help but remember, I've heard folks like Bart Davis and others, he used to preach that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu kind of discussion. And so a few of us got together and said, if that's where we're at, then we had better come forward with a option that we could at least live with and not just be subject to whoever brought whatever forward and it would be it. So that's where we created this concept that we're working with right now in Senate Bill 1025 that we will allow. And in fact, we build on the current Empowering Parents program. So we've got an existing program. We're not going to create something new. We're going to open it up a little bit. And I agree, it's a risk. You open it up for some tuitions. And we're going to add, of the $50 million there, we'll add 20. So that would basically put Empowering Parents from 30 to 50 million. The difference there is, if you were to think of what would a charter school light look like, that's kind of what it is. And it's meant to be a little lighter than our current charter schools as far as how we regulate them, but still require, if I'm going to give you public dollars, my expectation is that you don't discriminate based on regular discriminations. You don't teach DEI. You don't do all these things that we are so adamant about that we don't do. And so it's important that as we spend public dollars, they go to the public good. And this is a volunteer. So essentially we set up a minimum threshold of accountability. If a private or religious school would like to participate, there is a minimum level of accountability, a threshold that they can voluntarily adhere to. If so, then they are eligible to participate through the Empowering Parents program. If not, they're fine. This also doesn't include our homeschoolers. We have great homeschoolers who are successful. People sometimes say, well, what about the micro schools and these things? Our approach is this is a big step, and we're going to take it just one bite at a time and be very controlled with that. And for instance, I think there are many people who, if we have to go there, let's put the right kind of sideboards on it and treat it with respect as we go, not just never swimming before jump into the deep end.
Yeah. So if $20 million goes into that, the governor's proposed $50, where does the $30 million that he's proposed end up?
Well, that's a great question. And so as we think about how do we lift all Idaho students, not just those kids that want to go to private religious school, which ends up being a small portion, 5% maybe. One of our big challenges that we're really seeing is a hard thing in public education is our classroom discipline and special ed. As I mentioned before, as our culture has changed, students coming in seem to have a much higher propensity to both of those issues, self-control and special ed issues. So we know that we're about $60 million plus underspent at where we need to be on special ed. And a lot of those dollars that are being spent on special ed are now, because we don't fund it adequately in the funding formula, that has to come from the district general funds. So that's coming from people's property taxes. So this is an attempt to put the remaining $30 million in as a line item for special ed out there. And keep in mind that we're also working on a couple other bills that have another $50 million associated with behavior, literacy. That K-3 literacy is just absolutely essential. Those two things are just critical. So we're looking at from a holistic point of view.
Yeah.
So we go back to how do we help all kids with the stroke of the brush here, so to speak? And then is there a long term? What's on the horizon? Let's just not be satisfied with, hitting the problem of the day and not realize that there's a lot more to this that we need to be working on.
And the historical concern has been when you open up the gate to providing public funds to private institutions and education, that the dam will break and that will blow up our budgets, and it'll be hard to scale that back. And we've looked at other states. We've had some people on who've said, we don't want Idaho's budgets to look like that of Arizona's. Certainly you've been through this issue. Is there a concern that this is a step that's going to just end up costing us even an exorbitant amount in the long run?
Well, there is, and that's because people solve this on a short term. They go out and they hit this short term, but they don't come back and fix the problem. The reason people are abandoning, if you will, public education is because we have issues there. My thought is, let's keep our eye on the horizon. Let's make it so public education can actually compete, and that we can have that. The thought about going back to what I was mentioning earlier is, let's have those discussions at the local PTA. Let's help our local grassroots constituents, if you will, help us solve the problem. We need that pride and ownership back in our local schools. And to do that, we're going to have to change the rules, because we have a system that's so old and it's such a big ship, it's so hard to turn. I think we as a legislature have an opportunity in time. The timing is right for us to take a quick, hard look at it. Let's come back and let's really accelerate this evolution of public education in the next 3 to 5 years so that we can address the issue. If you don't address the issue of what's going on that's causing people to leave, there you go. It's basically going to eventually really be detrimental to public education. The problem is, in Idaho, that's where most of our kids are, and probably where most of our kids will remain. So it's upon us to be smart. If we're going to solve the problem, let's solve the real problem. Let's look at the long-term approach. And then let's make Idaho the leader. I mentioned this to the governor. I said, here's an opportunity for us. Our goal is to be recognized by our peers as leaders in the nation of how did you evolve public education to be the school of choice.
I think I'm getting it. So rather than just treat the symptoms, your goal is we're going to make our public schools in Idaho better and stronger. And by creating kind of that competitive market with private schools, a little bit of funding here, Still's going to sharpen Still, and you're going to kind of push them further. But your whole goal, number one pursuit of this is Idaho's public schools need to get stronger and better, and this is the way you're going to do it.
And they're not going to get there unless we, unfortunately, have to make some rather, to some, would appear as drastic changes. But that's only it's the disruptive change that we need. COVID kind of was the icing on the cake, and it set us on this course that we have to do something. So I'm saying let's use some educational leadership. Let's identify what our risks are, mitigate those risks, and move forward.
But this, I assume, this is not your dream bill. This isn't if Dave's king for a day, this is exactly what you, as you've mentioned, saw that there could be something that you don't want to live with come down, and you're going to scale that back and do something that will hopefully still get you the same result. Dave, that's unheard of in politics, to be proactive in solving a problem that isn't, I got 100% of what I want. It's regular in your marriage to make that compromise, as we've talked about. Particularly in D.C., nobody would ever put their neck out for something that wasn't perfect and take the political hit. Even in Idaho, does that not concern you that those who hate school choice in Idaho Falls are going to say, Dave, what are you doing? And not quite get that this is a necessary thing that you can live with, and you had to get out in front of it. It's just unheard of politically.
Well, it is, but if you come, you can come here for a lot of different reasons, and hopefully those who come here, in this case, with the students in mind. And I'm hoping that I have people know me well enough to know that I'm not selling out. I'm trying. This is a means to an end. Sometimes you have to take a half step to get to what you want to accomplish, and I certainly I'm not in favor of giving public funds to private religious schools. I don't think that's what we need to do. However, I think that's where we're at. And how do we accept where we're at and then get from there to where we need to be? And that is, let's take this half step. Let's get this. We've got sideboards built around this. They're pretty strict sideboards. I mean, it's testing. It's they have to report. It's really a charter school kind of light thing. And most of them, I think, we're going to say no. We don't want. It's too much, and I'm good with that. But again, I go back to, if this is a public dollar, and it's from my widow lady next door, that lives down the street from me, I have a responsibility to ensure that it's being that her dollar that she's sacrificing is being put to good use. And I think as a legislator and a policymaker, if I'm not watching out for that, I'm not serving very well.
It's a profile in courage. It's a man in the arena. I love, no matter however anyone feels about the legislation, I hope they recognize that this is political courage at its finest, Dave. This is you stepping up. It would be so much easier for you to say, this isn't what I want, so I'm just going to exit the arena. You guys fight it out, and if it doesn't work and hurts our state and makes our public schools worse, well, then I'll stand up and say, I told you so, and that I never wanted this. Credit to the doers, Dave. I think it's impressive.
Well, that's what I'm here for. And I'm just doing what I think most people would do. I serve with some of the greatest people I've ever known in the legislature. I mean, the folks in the Senate and in the House, I mean, there are literally some of the most impressive people I have ever known. And so it's just an honor and a privilege to be here. And my intent is to make the most difference I can with the time that I have here.
I'm impressed and always have been. Give us the insider baseball. You talked to the governor, and you've talked to your colleagues. I assume this is going to do pretty well in committee, but maybe not. What happens to your bill? Where do you think it goes? What are we hearing?
Well, great question. So this is Senate 1025. We just decided a few minutes ago to go ahead and run it on Monday through committee. I have an excellent committee, Senator Woodward, Cook.
We love Kevin.
Burnshaw. I mean, all of them are excellent. So did a run-through of it this afternoon, getting ready for Monday. We'll run it through committee on Monday. I'm confident it'll make it. We'll then schedule it for the floor. It's shaping up that Representative Horman has a bill on the House side, and we have this bill on the Senate side. And as usual in the legislature, you have these competing ideas. And I look at this as there's not a good or a bad. It's just we come from different perspectives on how we solve problems. And that's my sell here is, again, we're not solving just this problem. This is a bigger issue with more to it than just one bill. So my intent is I'd like to see this one pass. And most of my good friends who are saying, what in the world, why would we ever have a voucher? Why are we doing this? The reality is all this stuff is vouchers. I mean, we can call them ESA, we can call them tax credits, but at the end of the day, those are just workarounds. The purpose here is to take public money and give it to private schools. I mean, call it what you will. But I think the intent is that we've had is get the stakeholders around the table, try to find what can work for everyone, get us through the day, and then solve the big problem. Go after it.
What odds do you give it of making it to the governor's desk?
I think we're at least 50-50.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, I do. The reason is because this bill comes from what I consider a common sense point of view, and that is we're stepping into new ground here. Let's be careful. It's like I said before, let's not step off in the deep end before we learn how to swim.
Yeah.
This is a prudent, measured approach to change, and that's the approach we've tried to take. You can always lighten things up, but it's a lot harder to put things on going in. So we're thinking that whatever gets to the governor's desk will be the top measure. I mean, it's not going to get any stiffer than that. So I'd like to go to the governor with something that has all the right kind of sideboards on it that we can live with.
And the governor will sign it?
I think so. We've been very specific in trying to meet his requirements for fair, responsible, accountable, and transparent. Trying to meet those criteria. So when I do my presentation on Monday, that's what I'm talking about, and how this bill meets all of those things per the governor's request.
And I assume you and Representative Horman bills are mutually exclusive. It's one or the other in terms of actually becoming policy?
Well, since they cover two different things, mine addresses an existing system, which is empowering parents, adds the $20 million and then $30 for special ed. Hers really is a tax credit, so it's coming from a different direction. Theoretically, they both could pass. Theoretically.
It would, in theory, cost the state $100 instead of $50, though, right?
Oh, well, it would, yeah, because you're dipping into two pots of money there. You'd have to have it.
Well, I think it's really important that the public understands the complexity of what you're trying to do here and why your whole intention is to make the education system better and stronger. And I think you've articulated it well today. So I will ask our listeners, you need to share this episode. It needs to go out on the socials, share it with your friends and neighbors, your PTAs, because I think support it or oppose it, they need to understand it. You've been very kind with your time today. It's Friday and late, and you've got a great weekend ahead of you. But Dave, Chairman, as always, we just appreciate you.
Thanks so much, and I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss these important things with you.
Till next time.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.